Zach, do you know where Jeff is? Do you know Jeff? Whatever you guys want. Whatever you want to do. You like it? Okay, so I'll go. Jeff. I'll go see if I can find you. I'm sure he is. That would be. Here you come.
About ready to come get you.
All right, everybody, stick with me. This is our last panel. This one is going to focus on Good Neighbor Authority, and we at the Department of Agriculture recently entered into our first Good Neighbor Authority agreement, and so we're excited about that. And you know, hopefully we'll get some good results from that as well. But we've got some experts with us today that are going to talk a little bit about the environment of Good Neighbor Authority and how to use it. Some new things that are on the horizon. And so with that, Jeff, thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
And I'll turn it over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Apologies for being the last one up to the dais. Thank you very much for having me, hosting us, Western Governors. Another really, really superb program here. I love the idea that the West talks to each other and that we talk about working landscapes. Working landscapes is something I've been involved with all my career. So we're going to talk about Good Neighbor Authority, and for some unknown reason, they decided I'd lead off so I could give you kind of an overview of what G&A is. Anybody not know or ever heard of Good Neighbor Authority? Show of hands. Okay, so we already know. Oh, darn it. Okay.
Do we raise our hands if we know or don't know?
So, John, well, that was, have you never heard of it before? It's a double negative. So anyway, I'm going to have to explain it to my good friend John Ruhs, so bear with me. So Good Neighbor Authority's been around, actually started in Colorado back in 2001, and then Utah kind of came along, but it really got traction in 2008. It was in the 2014 Farm Bill, and the topic for this panel was G&A, disaster recovery and restoration. And at the time, we were kind of looking at the title, and we were talking to staff from WGA, and it was like, well, you know, G&A is not really about disaster recovery, but then after you think about the wonderful panels that have spoken this morning and the last panel that spoke, there's probably some opportunities for us to broaden our thinking just a little bit about the opportunities that G&A provides. So it is in the 2014 Farm Bill. It does identify there are opportunities for both the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, two separate departments, Interior and Ag, to engage with states to undertake work on federal land for forestry, watershed, and rangeland improvement activities. Like many of the western states, it's not, Arizona is not all forested. So there are a lot of opportunities for us to work with both the Forest Service and with the Bureau of Land Management. But I'm going to get into that after a bit. Let's talk about G&A some more. So under the Good Neighbor Authority, there are both cooperative agreements or contracts that allow the states to perform work on federal ground. How that looks in one of the individual 17 western states is dependent on the landscape and the nature and the organization of the state agencies, where the state forester is situated, whether it's a standalone like myself in Arizona with the Department of Forestry and Fire Management, or in something like the Wyoming Department of Ag or the Idaho Department of Lands or Montana DNRC or Nevada Sea and its conservation and natural resources. So, you know, every state's a little different. But these master agreements that state foresters typically sign with the regional foresters of the Forest Service basically set the stage, and then there are a series of different kinds of instruments, contracts and agreements that you can work up. At this point, we've got 37 states in the country that have signed master agreements under Good Neighbor Authority. When I got mine signed with the regional forester in the Southwest region, the Forest Service, Arizona, New Mexico, we were the 9th state to sign on. We've got a few things going right now, a lot more opportunity than agreements at this point. So we've been having a long-standing conversation with the Council of Western State Foresters and the Western Forestry Leadership Coalition. So there's some acronyms for that too. CWSF is the 17 Western State Foresters. The Western Forestry Leadership Coalition is the 17 Western State Foresters and the 7 regional foresters of the U.S. Forest Service. We've got shared staff down in Denver, Kelsey Delaney in the back of the room standing next to Bill Crapser, the amazing state forester in Wyoming. We've got shared staff. So, you know, if you're 50 miles from home, so Doug was nice enough to introduce me and say that, you know, I'm an expert. Well, you know, you're only an expert if you're 50 miles from home and you've got a briefcase. Well, we're in Crapser's hometown, so what does that tell you? But we've had this ongoing conversation because, you know, we're still trying to sort out what does good neighbor really mean, and we're trying to get it firmed up. So it's a hot topic in the Farm Bill reauthorization for 2018. There's some pretty good direction and support, you know, in the omnibus that was just passed this year by Congress. And so we're guardedly optimistic. We're still in the process of defining it for ourselves and creating good, solid examples and pathways to utilize another program in our whole suite of opportunities and activities across the state, local, county, federal, tribal, you know, construct that we have here in the country. So we're still we have this ongoing conversation. We're going to do 3 things near term. We're in the process right now. We've created a network, because in the West we're not about committees, but we have networks under the Council of Western State Foresters. And so we're gathering up all of our folks that are the leads in our respective states for Good Neighbor Authority, and they're actively engaged monthly now, sharing lessons learned and those sorts of things. We are going to convene a workshop on the implementation and information sharing on Good Neighbor Authority, and then both the Council of Western State Foresters and the Western Forestry Leadership Coalition are really driving hard right now to do some policy clarification at this point. So if you think you have an idea and there's enough financial capital and interest on the part of either the Forest Service or BLM, get with your local state forester and let's go make some magic. With that, I'm going to pass it off to my good friend John.
Well, John was adamant that he wanted a bat cleanup. So we're going to go to Mary second.
Hey.
Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Thanks for having me here today. Really appreciate the opportunity. I'm pretty passionate about the Good Neighbor Authority, and so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it with my esteemed colleagues to my right. I think we all come from a little different place, but for me, there is magic in the Good Neighbor Authority. And I think Jeff spoke about some of that flexibility, and I think that's key. And so what I would like to talk about is the Forest Service side of the perspective. And one of the Forest Service priorities, as well as the department's, is improving forest conditions. The Good Neighbor Authority is about that. And that's where we meet very closely with the state, is that opportunity to do more on the landscape. And that benefits the communities in every state, enhances our partnerships, and just bottom line, gets more done on the ground. Forest Service has some capacity challenges, and so this is a way for us to really expand what we're doing. And so there's lots of mutual benefit opportunities using the Good Neighbor Authority. So what I'd like to do is talk about, I guess, a little journey through a couple states, because I'd like to talk about the different models that every state has the opportunity to use, and they're not canned models. They're just things that have happened. People coming up with ideas, as Jeff mentioned. If you have an idea and there's a little bit of investment opportunity, cool things can happen. So I'd like to launch with experience in Idaho, and I was a forest supervisor on the Idaho Panhandle National Forest and had the really fun opportunity to work with State Forester David Ige as we established Good Neighbor Authority in Idaho. And it was kind of a fascinating thing. We started out pretty slow, but David was very passionate about what sort of interaction, what sort of way can the state work with the Forest Service to do more to benefit Idaho. And so David was very passionate about that, and we got a bunch of folks together and we started talking about opportunity, and it was really cool. So we started out slow with master agreement, both for Region 1 of the Forest Service and Region 4 of the Forest Service, because Idaho is kind of split in half. I don't know why, but so the two regional foresters signed a master agreement in Idaho to cooperate with the state using Good Neighbor Authority. And so we started slow and had projects where, you know, the state's expertise in Idaho is really management of their timbered endowment lands. And so we capitalized on, with Idaho Department of Lands, their timber expertise. And so we started slow, started using through the Good Neighbor Authority their timber expertise to augment capacity on some very specific projects. Then we started to see that that was working really slick. And so we expanded that quite a bit. Had lively discussions with my very good friend David Ige, and he said, "Mary, not doing NEPA. I don't want anything to do with NEPA. I don't really, no, NEPA can't be a part of this gig. We're not doing it," which is true. But we were able to work through that there's a great opportunity because the Forest Service in Idaho has a little capacity issue around NEPA, in fact, in many places. And so what we did find out we could do together very effectively is the state could contract NEPA to be done, could contract specialists, could contract and not be involved in the NEPA, but do the contracting, which was far more expedient than the Forest Service could do, to get us resource specialists so that we could progress much faster. So it was some lively conversations around NEPA, but we were able to get past that, and that's some of the beauty of the innovation that can go on. So right now we're doing in Idaho a full process project for timber sales, from recon, layout, contracting NEPA or specialists in concert with the Forest Service, some the pre-sale work, the sale of the timber sale, the administration of it clear to the end of the project, including other resource work that can be done. Through that process, the sale of the timber can go into a pot called program income. And that has proven very successful. That program income, which can be a sizable chunk of change, then can be spun back into resource work and or new NEPA to do more work on the ground. And so it really can perpetuate more on the landscape. So that's the Idaho model. I want to hop real quick to Utah, and I recently switched jobs and have the opportunity to work with another batch of states. In Utah, it's very different model entirely. So we are using, the Forest Service is using the Good Neighbor Authority as the mechanism to distribute funding to a partnership, and that's called the Watershed Restoration Initiative. And so it's our mechanism for putting money in the pot. There's over 500 partnerships with agencies, other entities, and individuals who contribute funds into the Watershed Restoration Initiative. So if we put some cashola in through the Good Neighbor Authority, usually we're getting payback of over a 6-to-1 ratio. We're not just doubling, but way far more than that. Our investment for restoration activities, hazardous fuels treatment, those things that we all have common interest in. And so it's a very different model, but no less effective use of the Good Neighbor Authority than the Idaho model. So one thing that the Watershed Restoration Initiative was able to do and demonstrate, witnessed it firsthand this year, we had a little bit of a challenging fire season. And we had some instances where within a number of days of the suppression effort kind of wrapping up, we were going to get some thunderstorms causing dramatic debris flows similar to the slides that we saw earlier. Utah has that thing that happens. And so we were all desperate to do the parts and pieces that each agency could do as far as that restoration and protection of water systems, community water systems that were hindered by the fires. We were able to contact the Watershed Restoration Initiative because they were the bank, and we all agreed that if we could use those monies, those could be put immediately to the restoration efforts. We would replace it later, and we got the work done on the ground before the storms came. And so as far as a use for after fire situations or other disasters, there is a way to do that sort of innovative work. It just might be in a different model. So Utah was pretty good. And then just kind of wrapping up, I think I'm going to get the hook here pretty soon. Wyoming is kind of an interesting, once again, a different scenario. And the exciting piece that is happening in Wyoming is that we are working with other state entities other than just the forestry divisions. And so we have worked, both regions 2 of the Forest Service and Region 4 has worked on agreements with not only the Department of Forestry, which we have an agreement with, and are doing projects through that agreement, but also with Game and Fish to do habitat enhancement work that both Game and Fish and the Forest Service is very interested in completing. We have mutual interests in those sort of projects, so we have an opportunity there, very different. And then the latest one, as Doug mentioned, is we have a new master agreement under GNA to work with the Department of Agriculture and do some range enhancement work. And so that's really exciting. It's very different. It's a different piece of the model. So in Wyoming, we're working with different state agencies to do the cool stuff that the state needs done, the Forest Service needs done. We have mutual interests in. Just a couple things I might mention. A couple challenges. We have in Idaho, we have begun to exceed their capacity. And so that is a good problem to have because we're doing a whole lot more work on the ground than we were, say, 3 years ago. But we're going through some growing pains there. So we're working on that. And then the other challenge is if you're doing soup to nuts project with the state, we do 10-year master agreements with the Forest Service for the Good Neighbor master agreements. Well, if you start with a summer of doing some layout and design, and then you spend a summer doing surveys, you do NEPA over a year or so, and then you sell a timber sale, and a timber purchaser can have up to 4 years to remove the logs. That's when the money is collected into program income. You're running out of the 10 years in order to spend the program income that was collected to go towards resource work. And so that is starting to be a concern because then it goes back to the Treasury. And so we want to keep that money of program income on the ground. And so we're working currently on figuring out how to extend that 10-year master agreement so that if we're doing that sort of long-term project work with the state agency, we don't run into peril of losing that money to the on-the-ground place. So for me, the beauty and the magic with Good Neighbor Authority is around its lack of structure, because the different models are working for where the state finds itself, where different state agencies find themselves, where we have mutual interests, where we can be innovative and do more without a lot of constraints. And so encourage the flexibility and the innovation that can come around something that is kind of wide open and we can innovate around it. With that, I'll pass it to John.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Ruhs. I am the Assistant Director for BLM's Fire and Aviation Program. I want to thank WGA and the staff. It's a great opportunity to be here. And obviously, I want to thank all the panelists and participants because it's been a pretty good event, and it's kind of nice to be on the tail end of it because we've been able to observe the whole shooting match here, and it's been very, very beneficial for me. I guess just want to talk a little bit about the background. Jeff gave you a lot of background. It was originally a pilot program, actually, for the Forest Service in the state of Colorado. BLM has been very limited on our ability to participate. We were first added in 2004, and then in 2014, the authority was expanded, and that helped us quite a bit. I think as both Jeff and Mary have talked about, there is a lot of excitement around the Good Neighbor Authority and the opportunities that are there for us. There are a broad scope of management activities that are provided for us that we're able to use Good Neighbor Authority on. A lot of those things can be routine maintenance or management activities, but there is, I believe, opportunities for restoration, reclamation, and recovery. Again, I think for BLM, we're still in that growing phase. We're still trying to learn and understand what all the options are. But I think there's a lot of opportunity, and we'll continue to move forward with that. Again, as Jeff said, we can enter into agreements and contracts. Probably one of the nicest things for us, though, is the ability to use that at that field office level, at our lowest level, and that's really where the work needs to happen most of the time anyway, and that's where we need to be moving forward with and putting our focus on. A lot of our work, again, it isn't in the forestry arena. We have some, but a lot of it's going to be in that rangeland setting, and there's a lot of opportunity for us there that we haven't really tapped into yet. A couple of things that Good Neighbor Authority can't be used for, things like road construction and parking areas, buildings, etc. And then, as Mary mentioned, we can't delegate the NEPA responsibility, but we can share the opportunity, enjoy that process, if you will. I think for us, Good Neighbor Authority really aligns with where our Secretary of Interior, where his priorities are. And then for us, that's pretty important because that's where we want to be as we're moving forward with doing things. This next list, I'm not going to read it, but it's just kind of a highlight. It's not all the accomplishments that BLM has had so far with Good Neighbor Authority, but it just touches on a couple of them. There are other things happening throughout the various states, and like Mary said, there's no real framework for it, and I think that's the joy of working with Good Neighbor Authority is there's a lot more things that we can be doing and that we are trying to get started. You heard in the last panel, I talked a little bit about the cohesive strategy, and for us, we also believe that the Good Neighbor Authority fits right there with that strategy and with the goals that are part of the cohesive strategy. As we heard, resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, and safe and effective wildfire response, Good Neighbor Authority is very, very adept at helping us achieve those goals. I think the other thing for us that we probably haven't tapped into enough yet is we've developed a lot of RFPAs in some of our states, Idaho being at the forefront of that, but that's an area where I think we can use Good Neighbor Authority even more than we are, and that's one we'll be continuing to work on. So I think just going forward, again, we need to, as an agency, BLM, we need to continue to expand the use of the Good Neighbor Authority. I think we can do it in partnership with all the federal agencies and with our state partners. I think there's an opportunity for us to do a lot of upfront collaborative work before fires happen, and I think that's an area, again, that we need to tap into a little harder. And then you know, you can't ever forget the importance of communication. And I think if we sit down at the table, we can talk about those areas where the Good Neighbor Authority is the tool that will help us achieve a lot of the things that we need to accomplish. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Doug.
Thank you, John. That was informative. Like I mentioned earlier, the Department of Ag is just entering into its first Good Neighbor Authority for hopefully some range improvements and some work surrounding grazing on Forest Service. The first question that I'll start with is really for Mary and John. And would you agree that Good Neighbor Authority indicates that states are far superior to federal agencies for ecosystem management?
You knew that was coming.
I'm just kidding.
You knew that.
That's not really the question.
Wait a minute.
But Mary, you did mention in your remarks that Idaho has exceeded their capacity. I'm
Yes,
assuming that
that is
Idaho
true.
has not exceeded their need for NEPA work. So are there other projects that are exceeding Idaho's capacity? What is their limiting factor?
We've exceeded their current capacity, and so that's important because we're working on it. And working with Idaho Department of Lands, they plan on bringing on, I believe, 7 foresters, new foresters, using Good Neighbor Authority to help support the Forest Service and the work that we would like to do together. And so, but it takes them, just like it takes a long time for Forest Service to hire folks, it takes the state a little while too, and they need to get approval from their legislature to do such things. They also, so they are staffing up, but it takes a little while to do that. In the past 3 years, we've just exponentially ramped up the work in Idaho, and so we're playing catch up. And so it's not a bad thing, and it's being troubleshooted between both of us, both the Forest Service and IDL. The other thing that we've exceeded actually is because of these pots of program income funding that is derived from the sale of the timber sales that they're working on. I believe and I don't know the state financial language very well, but I believe they've exceeded their ability to spend money. And so they can't spend the program income because it sits in a state pot. So it's federal money, but in order to spend it, the state has to have the authority from their legislature to spend that amount of money. Well, we are talking sizable program income in North Idaho if you're talking sale of large timber. I believe the Nez Perce Clearwater has probably several $1 million in their program income pot. I know the Idaho Panhandle has about $3 or $4 million in their program income pot that we want to spend on restoration work, future projects, but they need the authority to spend that level of money, which they weren't anticipating. So it's the growth of the program that has worked so darn well. So it's a good program, a good problem to have, and they're working on it, is the answer. So it's not that we're just stuck. They're working on their proposal for the hiring of the 7 folks. They're working on increasing their authority to spend their budget cap, or whatever it's called.
That answer actually makes really good sense to me, because I've ran up against that as well within my own programs, where all I really need is budget authorization, spending authorization. But it does weird things to your budget, and it looks funny, because the assumption is that those are all state dollars.
Yeah,
And so
and
when you increase your spending authority, it artificially looks like you've increased your budget as well. And so that's some of the limiting factors of state agencies, and even getting authority to spend federal money, is that the optics aren't necessarily all that great for state agencies, just because it looks like a budget increase.
So it's a communication issue as well as a real challenge thing. It's how do we explain what's really happening because of those optics?
Thank you for that.
So I think that another perspective on that, as we look at the needs that are on the ground, each of the agencies, whether it's a state agency or whether it's a federal agency, we have expertise in certain areas. And I think that's where that communication comes in. We sit down at the table and we can talk about which agency has the expertise and the staff power, if you will, to maybe accomplish the things that need to be done. And then how do we marry that up together so that we can move forward and you know, be more efficient and to accomplish more positive things on the ground. I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that most state agency people have big heads. Oh, sorry, Doug.
Back at you, Doug.
But it really comes down to who has the staff power, who has the time and the ability to get things done, and how do we enhance each other's ability to get things done.
Yeah. You know, if I could weigh in, you know, I think it is about synergy and finding the fit and not being bashful about being creative. If you think you've got a real world problem, I think we've got a lot of opportunity to create, you know, workable solutions within the loose construct of, you know, policy, direction, and law. A couple of things real quick. Arizona, I've got the authorization to hire 11 new staff, but it's got to be funded by G&A from the Forest Service. And the conditioners put on that by the governor's chief of operations and the policy advisor were that it needs to demonstrate a substantial increase in efficiencies, which I'm pretty confident we can do. You know, the 2014 Farm Bill had some really forward-looking things. Congress continues to try to find ways to give us permission to succeed. You know, the categorical exclusion, you know, for project areas under 3,000 acres. Well, some folks, you know, in you know, various corners of our society, you know, feel like that's either piecemeal or that we're, you know, we're trying to suborn the responsibilities under the National Environmental Policy Act or the Endangered Species Act, which really isn't the case. The reality is we've got a lot of work to do and we have to get to it. We're not going to sell our environmental quality down the river at the expense of going out and doing something bad for the land. We're all committed to doing good things on the land. I did want to bring up a couple other things. So the counties and the tribes under this current reauthorization of the Farm Bill are looking to see about having an opportunity along with the states to participate in Good Neighbor Authority. And a number of people have asked me, you know, are you okay with that? And could you support us? I said, well, absolutely. You know, none of us is as smart as all of us. And if somebody's got capacity to do something good on a part of the state that I'm, you know, claim that I'm native to, I'm all in for that sort of thing. I don't care who does it. I just want to get some good stuff done. But I did want to point out that, you know, we've got a really strong relationship in Arizona with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, another Department of Agriculture agency, through EQIP. And we've got shared positions. We've got 4 foresters that are shared positions within RCS, and we're doing a lot of really high quality work on our private forested and rangelands in Arizona. And so our construct in Arizona is, if I've got a willing landowner that's got 400 acres of timbered ground, there are millions of acres of Forest Service land that needs work around that piece of private property. So we go in there, we write up a practice plan for that particular piece of ground with a willing landowner, and then I go to the Forest Service and I say, gee, you know, for another, you know, we can get a lot of added work done at a very, very minimal cost if we'll just expand the boundary, and then we're pairing up the EQIP NRCS program with the Good Neighbor Authority program, and pretty quick we're doing 10,000 acres instead of 400.
One of the exciting aspects for me with Good Neighbor Authority, getting back to the examples of Idaho using contractors for NEPA work, is that I think as Good Neighbor Authority expands its use, particularly in the West, it gives us as state agencies an example to have a better selection of contractors who are adept at NEPA, have experience with it, and can cleanly do that. Hopefully the price of those analysis will go down as experience goes up. And in addition to that, one of the points that you made, Jeff, about categorical exclusions on areas of less than 3,300 acres. And the criticism that categorical exclusions are somehow subverting NEPA. Right. Slade Franklin and I went to Washington, D.C. to testify on a proposed bill year before last. And one of the points that we were trying to drive home were that categorical exclusions are not a workaround to NEPA. They're a part of NEPA.
Exactly. Right.
And one of the things that drives me crazy about all of this is that, particularly for restoration projects, you wouldn't propose the project if you expected that EA or that EIS to indicate a net loss.
Right.
So it's one of those frustrations that I think maybe we can work on. Mm-hmm. But categorical exclusions are certainly applicable in areas where you're working invasive species or if you're working on restoration projects. It should be simple. Okay, switching tracks again. You see me go down this NEPA path all the time. I call it never-ending progress abatement. GNA contracts involve a lot of partners, obviously. State agencies are federal partners and private contractors as well. Can you discuss some regulatory requirements that need to be met by each of those parties? Do local timber companies have to satisfy certain guidelines that they would not when performing work on state or private land?
Would you all like me to take a first stab? So I'm not sure I can fully answer that total question, but in my experience when I was working with Department of Lands, the Department of Lands becomes the agent of the Forest Service. So the requirements need to match Forest Service requirements in the end. So they need to, for example, on a timber sale, the end product needs to meet our specs. How the state would get to that may look very different than how the Forest Service would do it, but the state would act as an agent of the Forest Service, so meet all our requirements. As far as private industry, if it's a state contract, the contractor, whether it be a timber company or a NEPA contractor or somebody doing excavator woods work, something like that, they need to meet the specifications of whoever granted the contract. So while we might be working with the state to do a suite of work under Good Neighbor Authority, if the state granted the contract, end result would meet Forest Service's needs and requirements, but it could be done under the state's contract. And so the contractor would need to meet the rules of the state, but the end result needs to meet the ultimate requirements of the Forest Service. So a private timber industry may work under a state timber sale contract for a Forest Service outcome, which is a little bit of an oddity, and we're learning. But the end result needs to be the same as if the Forest Service had done it. That's where some of the efficiencies may come to be very true. That's what we're hoping for. Same with contracting. The state can contract quicker, faster, all those sorts of things, cheaper. But the specs in that contract would be very similar for the end result. So Jeff, did I get that about right?
No, I don't want to say anything more because I think you nailed it, Mary. That's certainly our perspective in Arizona, and I will say just a little more. From the procurement side, acquisition management is working really hard with us in Arizona today, Forest Service acquisition management, to try to come up with some creative ways to really change the frame and expedite a lot of our forest restoration and watershed protection work to minimize the threat of unwanted wildfire in Arizona. And we're working with the Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, a large utility, Arizona Commerce Authority, and my department are working to try to expedite some things on the biggest NEPA process ever undertaken, the Forest Restoration Initiative, EIS. So it makes perfect sense that if you're operating on federal ground, you need to adhere and observe and recognize the organic legislation that drives whatever jurisdiction that is, be it BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, whatever. So it makes perfect sense. So those are the rules of the road. I guess the cautionary tale would be, let's not get so overambitious that we break something in the process. If it's a little hard and there's a little bit of process stuff to go through the DEAN process. But I totally agree, and thank you, Doug, for hitting one of my hot buttons. I did NEPA. I was a federal employee for about 36 and a half years, and then I finally got smart and, my IQ went up. I became a state employee.
We're getting beat up, John. We're getting beat up.
Yes,
But I was blessed to have a terrific career, but I was cursed to have to do a considerable amount of NEPA over my career. And there's only four considerations under the National Environmental Policy Act as inculcated in the regs, and it's just to disclose the effects of your actions. Well, if you've had 100 timber sales on the same kind of ground, how hard do you have to analyze it? It doesn't say you're not going to analyze it, but you've already overanalyzed the effects. You should be able to go down through a compendium and just pull out the things that apply there in terms of whatever species of interest occur there, what are your critical watershed issues, all those kinds of considerations. You can do a categorical exclusion. It's a complete analysis under NEPA, and a lot of people think that you're trying to shortcut it or support NEPA, so thank you for that comment.
Well, John, this next question is for you. I know that was a good presentation on the evolution of Good Neighbor Authority within BLM. And I think we understand that. Do you see any barriers to being able to expand Good Neighbor Authority? Where are you guys in the process? What do you see in the foreseeable future about expansion of use of that tool for you?
So I think there are a couple of barriers that I can talk about. One, I really liked what Jeff said about expansion of the Good Neighbor Authority to counties and other entities, because a lot of the areas where BLM works, a lot of the expertise is actually at that county level, and there are some counties that have the resources and the capability to provide some assistance to us. So I think that's a good factor, because in a lot of cases the state agencies, they don't have any more capacity than the BLM does. So I think that's a barrier in some sense, but I think there's ways to get around that. I think another barrier for my agency is the fact that we have to do a stronger job of educating the line managers on the ability to use Good Neighbor Authority and what opportunities there are with it. And I don't think we've done that yet. We've hit some policy and we've started to move that direction, but we haven't actually started educating people. And it's hard if you're standing on the ground, if you're a field manager on the ground and you've never used a certain, in this case, Good Neighbor Authority, and nobody around you has, where do you go? You don't have that knowledge base, and so that's something that we need to work on, and we really need to push that harder. So I think probably that's the biggest barrier that I see in our agency.
Yeah, and that leads into another question. So you have this culture limitation, right, of implementing Good Neighbor Authority to the best of your ability. How much does leadership play into that, and is that situated correctly at BLM, do you think, or do you have limitations there right now? You don't have to throw anybody under the bus. We can speak in general.
I would only throw myself under the bus. I do think there's some leadership issues there. We have the ability to use the tool, and it comes back to, again, the knowledge base, and I just don't think that at any level of the organization we haven't got to the point to where it's a common thing for us to do. You can go back to our Organic Act, and being a good neighbor is kind of in flip. It tells us we're supposed to be a good neighbor. So it's not a new concept, but it's just figuring out how to use that concept, to use that authority, and I'm not sure that we've gotten to the place where, again, it's just common practice, and that's where we need to be. And I think we'll get there pretty quick. We just need to have some good examples of it and continue to educate and show people it can be done.
Perfect. Under Good Neighbor agreements, we've been over that that the NEPA review always remains under federal authority, right? And so I think as states, we can help contribute to that process. And over time, as GNA has evolved a little bit, have you seen improvements in NEPA timelines as a result of good neighbor authorities? What could we work on as states?
Well, I'll try to answer that. So I have kind of two-part answer maybe. In several instances, and I refer to my very good friend David Greshel's comments, I want nothing to do with that NEPA stuff. So there's a piece of that, but at the same time, the states absolutely are contributing to Project NEPA by commenting, by us getting together and gaining alignment on what's needed on the landscape. And having those conversations as we've never had those conversations before. We're far more advanced moving forward in partnership with not just collaborative groups, but our county partners, our state partners, and others. I don't think that's really tied to GNA particularly, but it all is an enhanced communication package of working together in order to get good things done on the landscape. So it's not really through good neighbor authority, but through being a cooperating agency or being knowledgeable and sharing on a routine basis at the field leadership level, what are you doing and why are you doing it, and having those discussions, either informally, just a chat over, say, a agency leadership breakfast with a couple colleagues that are in the neighborhood, or a formal cooperating agency on a large-scale veg project. It can take very different forms. I cannot say that working together part is shortening timelines. I think what it's doing is making more effective projects and having us be far more in alignment and sharing risk into the future, sharing vision. But I don't see it cutting down timelines yet. If we contract NEPA, say through the Good Neighbor Authority, through the state, it's still contracted NEPA, and the Forest Service can contract NEPA directly, can work with the state to contract NEPA, but that really doesn't affect timelines. It's just a process. The real timeline issue is talking about what sort of NEPA document are you going to use. Are you going to use a Farm Bill authority that allows you to go speedy? Or are you going to do a longer term EA? And why are you doing that EA when you have a body of work that would tell you there's no significant impacts? And it's that training and expertise that we're working on right now in the Forest Service to change that decision point, because historically, oh, well, that takes an EA, we just better do an EA, because that's what's expected of us. That's what the courts want. And instead, I think we're in a new era of saying what's really necessary to document the environmental effects, to communicate to the public what we're doing with the project, and move on and get over it and get more work done. So not the timelines yet.
I appreciate that. One more question before we turn it over to the attendees. During the National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative, Western Governors Association workshop participants for that one highlighted increasing the operating window for stewardship contracts from 10 to 20 years as a high priority policy fix. Any similar concrete recommendations for improving good neighbor authority agreements? I know you talked about expanding timelines a little bit in your opening remarks. Other comments that you would have for improvement? Recommendations for WGA?
For me, it's working on that, and I think that may be an internal issue. We may have the ability to change that internally, so I'm not quite positive. We're in the process of looking at about the 10-year master agreement. My big thing is in seeking improvements, don't make it more complicated or more restrictive. Keep it open for innovation.
Thank you.
Can I add on that as well? And I think I just want to reiterate something that Jolie said on the previous panel. And there are a number of opportunities with Good Neighbor Authority to bring Department of Interior and BLM in line with where the Forest Service is at. And I guess that's something that WGA could help us with, because that is a limitation for us.
Different authorities.
Well, you know, I could not agree more. I like the idea, Mary, that, you know, let's keep it simple. Let's not make it overly restrictive. We have a tendency to look for structure, and then we wind up being our own worst enemy. There is a nice document. I wanted to point everybody's attention to, if you haven't heard of the Rural Voices Conservation Coalition, they're an amazing group. In September of 2018, they put out a little document, Understanding GNA, with 6 Western state case studies. It's very well prepared. I know that Troy with WJ will get you the link if you want it. So thank you, Troy.
Let me finish this title. Okay. Do we have any questions? Ann?
So I'm really excited to hear that there's 37 states that have signed agreements. I think that's a fabulous step forward. Have you talked about how you're going to be reporting the acres treated? I know that's going to be a very big question for Congress, reauthorization and looking at the future. You know, we talk about adaptive management. Are you going to be doing any analysis of those projects to see where you could maybe improve in maybe the states that have not signed on or are struggling?
Are you asking me, Ann?
I'm asking everyone up there because I'm hoping y'all figure it out and you don't double count acres.
So real quickly, the exciting thing is that the Forest Service about 8 years ago decided that it would be really good to have a common set of metrics that they could use to message to both the Office of Management and Budget and to the Hill, to the Senate, to Congress. And in Arizona, we've got what's known as the Arizona Management System. It's kind of a lean management process. There is a contractor, Timmons Group, that's been doing that work for the National Association of State Foresters and the Forest Service nationally. And the good news is we're capturing that data, but there's also a lot of upward reporting that goes on, not only within the state agency, you know, to the governor's office on my part, but I won't speak for the feds, but I do know how that upward reporting goes. So we're tracking all of that, and we're messaging that. It's important that we capture that and share that with OMB and Congress.
Any other questions?
Can I just lean in just a quickie on that one? I would say we don't have it figured out so very well. We do a tremendous amount of reporting. I have had direct conversations, predominantly in Idaho, with what constitutes additive, because there's a desire by everybody for the Good Neighbor Authority to be additive to our programs. At least that's the vibe. And so we've had those conversations, but it's a little hard to tell what's additive if your budget goes down and Good Neighbor comes up a little bit. We stay equal as far as acres treated. Was it additive, or did it just keep our program from falling? And so there's some dilemmas there. It's not easy as to what was the baseline before Good Neighbor Authority started, and are we doing more than we were? Is it because of our work on environmental analysis and decision-making and improving our NEPA process? Or is it because we're doing more work with the states? Or is it because we're working with our collaborative groups better? Or what is it becomes a little hard to know. So that dialogue is ongoing. We all want to see more projects on the ground, and I think ultimately it's to reduce the impacts of catastrophic fire. So can we see those impacts reducing that yet? I'm not sure we can, but it's more complex than just a data set as to how many acres you treated and who did it or who contributed to doing that and who paid for it. It's a little bit of a weird thing.
Thank you. Anything else from attendees? Any other questions, comments on this panel? If not, I'd like to thank the panel for taking the time and coming here and sharing some wisdom with us. I know for me it was particularly beneficial. It's relevant for me, and so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Okay, everybody, we're at the end here, and I just need to let you know some information about this workshop and some others that are forthcoming on behalf of Western Governors Association before we go. But first, I just need to express sincere appreciation to all of you who took the time out of your schedules to come and make this interactive workshop a success. So thank you for coming. We had a lot of information, and we anticipate the findings are going to be incorporated into future Western Governors Association efforts under this Working Lands Roundtable effort. Beyond the broader Working Lands Roundtable effort, please join Western Governors Association for the remaining 2 initiative workshops for Hawaii Governor David Ige, Biosecurity and Invasive Species Initiative. The dates and locations and topics for these last 2 workshops are as follows. On November 14th, there will be a workshop on EDRR, Early Detection and Rapid Response, in Helena, Montana. And then on the island of Hawaii, December 9th and 10th, they'll be addressing biosecurity and agriculture. Workshops will be followed by a series of targeted webinars focusing on discrete issues related to biosecurity and invasive species management. WGA will also continue to lead the conversation on invasive species by hosting an invasive mussels leadership forum in Denver early next year. During that meeting, Western leaders on invasive mussel management will come together to develop new strategies for halting the spread of quagga and zebra mussels in the West. The outcomes of the initiative workshops and webinars will be incorporated into an initiative report, and that will be published by the association next summer. The deliverables, policy recommendations, and action items contained within the report will be implemented by the association Working Lands Roundtable in the coming years. If you want recordings of this roundtable, they'll be available on WGA's website. Please share these with contacts who couldn't make it to the event. If you find a certain panel very beneficial for you, we encourage you to share those. Lastly, personally, I need to thank the staff of WGA for putting this on and for including me. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you to WGA, and if we can help in any way at the Department of Ag, let me know. And if you've got anything further, please.
Just 2 quick notes from WGA. Please put your name tags on their table so we can recycle when you're done. But more importantly, I would just like to, just to Doug, I'd really just like let you know we really appreciate your moderation. Did a great job. Wouldn't have been the same without you. So if everyone can just give Doug a round of applause. Thank our moderator. Did an excellent job.
Thank you. That's nice of you. Thanks for sticking with me.